In 1995, the Central Intelligence Agency admitted, on the record, that it had spent $20 million over 23 years paying psychics to spy on the Soviet Union. In 1974, one of those psychics described, in detail, a Soviet weapons facility he had never visited, and cranes and gantries he sketched turned out to match satellite photographs taken months later. In 1988, a physicist named Edwin May took over that same program and ran it with tighter controls than most Cold War weapons research ever saw. And after all of that, the money, the 23 years, the sketches that matched satellite photos, the CIA shut the whole thing down and concluded, officially, in a report you can still read today, that there was no scientific evidence anyone had ever done anything paranormal at all. That is the part nobody tells you. Not that the psychics failed. That the report describing their failure is more interesting than any claim of their success. Here is what almost everyone who considers themselves scientifically literate believes about this story, and I want to state it as charitably as I can, because it's not a stupid belief. It's a lazy one, which is different. The belief goes like this. The CIA tried something silly, spent government money on nonsense the way governments sometimes do. Some scientists eventually pointed out there was no real effect, and the program got canceled the way any failed experiment gets canceled. Boring. Embarrassing. Filed under Cold War paranoia, next to fluoride conspiracy theories and UFO weather balloons. The story ends with a shrug. Of course, psychics aren't real. Why would anyone need 23 years and $20 million to figure that out? I'm going to spend the next several minutes taking that shrug apart, because that shrug is hiding the single most important thing this story can teach you, and it has nothing to do with whether anyone can read minds. Start with the sketch that matched the satellite photo, because that's the detail that keeps this story alive at dinner parties. A man named Pat Price, working for a lab at Stanford Research Institute in 1974, was given only geographic coordinates, no name, no description, and asked to describe what was there. He drew cranes. He drew a gantry structure. Months later, reconnaissance photos of a Soviet nuclear facility at Semipalatinsk showed cranes and a gantry structure in roughly the position he'd drawn. If I stopped the story here, you'd have every right to be unsettled. I was unsettled the first time I read the case file. But here is the open loop I want you holding for the next few minutes. The exact same laboratory, using the exact same method, on the exact same subject, also produced dozens of sketches that matched nothing at all. And those sketches did not make it into the briefing that went up the chain to Congress. Hold on to that asymmetry. It's going to matter more than the crane drawing ever did. I need to tell you something about how I ended up caring about this story. Because it wasn't through espionage or physics. It was through a much smaller and, in its own way, much more humiliating experience. Years ago, before I did this for a living, I ran a very small classroom demonstration for a statistics course, the kind every instructor runs at some point. I asked 40 students to each flip a coin 10 times and write down the results, and I told them, quite honestly, that I would then guess which student had flipped the coin. What I didn't tell them is that with 40 students flipping 10 coins each, the odds that at least one of them gets a run of 8 or more heads or tails in a row are actually quite good, better than half. When I guessed the student with the long streak and got it right, half the room looked at me like I'd read their minds. I hadn't done anything except understand, cold, mechanically, that with enough attempts, something that looks miraculous in isolation is actually guaranteed in aggregate. That single classroom moment did more to shape how I think about extraordinary claims than 4 years of formal training did, because it taught me the exact shape of the trap. The trap isn't in any single result. It's in how many attempts you don't see. That's the gear that breaks in the Pat Price story, and I want to open it up completely, because vague skepticism is worthless, and precise skepticism is a tool you can actually use. The Stanford Research Institute remote viewing program, across its full run, conducted literally hundreds of individual viewing sessions. Analysts back at the CIA weren't shown raw transcripts blind. They were shown the transcripts alongside the target information and asked to judge, after the fact, how well they matched. This is called outcome-then judgment, and it is one of the oldest, best-documented failure modes in experimental psychology, because human beings are pattern-matching animals of staggering ability, and staggering ability comes at a cost. We can find a pattern connecting almost anything to almost anything else if we're allowed to look at the answer first and then go hunting for the resemblance. Cranes and gantries are not exotic shapes. Industrial and military installations built in the mid-20th century all over the world share an enormous common vocabulary of towers, girders, fences, and rectangular buildings, because they were all solving the same engineering problems with the same available materials. A sketch of a tall structure with cross-bracing near a flat industrial yard is not a specific hit. It is a description that fits an enormous fraction of Cold War infrastructure on either side of the Iron Curtain. The remarkable part isn't that one sketch resembled one facility. The remarkable part is that out of hundreds of sketches, defenders of the program can point to only a handful of resemblances this loose and treat each one as if it were a fingerprint. Here's the loop closing and a new one opening in its place. The asymmetry I asked you to hold on to. The sketches that matched going up the chain. The sketches that didn't, quietly disappearing from the file. That asymmetry has a name. It's called the file drawer problem, and it is not unique to psychics. It is, without exaggeration, one of the 2 or 3 biggest crises in modern experimental science generally, and I want you to sit with that sentence, because I am not softening the CIA's psychics by comparing them to real science. I am hardening the case against real science by comparing it to the psychics. Here's the new loop. In 2005, a Stanford epidemiologist named John Ioannidis published a paper with the almost insolent title, "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." It became one of the most cited papers in the history of medicine. Ioannidis wasn't talking about psychics. He was talking about cancer drug trials, nutrition studies, genetic association research, real laboratories, real peer review, real double-blind protocols. And his argument rested on precisely the mechanism I just walked you through with Pat Price's cranes. When you run enough studies, and only the ones that hit get published, written up, cited, and remembered, while the ones that miss get quietly filed away, you can generate an entire literature of impressive-looking, statistically significant findings, almost none of which will replicate. The psychic spies and the pharmaceutical industry were, at different points in the 20th century, running the exact same flawed machine. One of them had better funding. I promised you I'd come back to the shrug, the "of course it's fake" dismissal. And here is the first return, because I want you to notice it's already changed shape. The shrug says the story is boring because nothing paranormal happened. I'm telling you the story is not boring because something extremely normal happened. And normal is far more dangerous than paranormal because normal doesn't announce itself. Nobody has to believe in SP to fall into this trap. You just have to be human, keep score selectively, and remember your hits better than your misses. Every gambler who just knows a slot machine is due, every parent convinced a vaccine caused a symptom that appeared in the following weeks purely by coincidence, every executive certain their gut instinct called the market. Same gear, same brake, no crystal ball required. Now, the number I actually want you to feel in your stomach, because I chose it over several equally accurate ones, specifically because it does something the others don't. Across the entire 23-year run of the American government's paranormal espionage program, the final, formal, congressionally reviewed conclusion, reached by an independent panel that included a Nobel laureate physicist, was that remote viewing had never once been demonstrated at a level exceeding chance under properly controlled conditions. 23 years, $20 million. Zero. Sit with the zero for a second, because the number by itself would just be a punchline. And I don't want a punchline, I want a mechanism. The zero doesn't mean nothing interesting happened in that program. It means everything interesting that happened inside the minds of the analysts grading the transcripts, not inside the minds of the people supposedly viewing Soviet military bases from a locked room in Virginia. I want to give you a second historical thread here, because this isn't only a government story, and I don't want you thinking the lesson is don't trust spy agencies. In the 1970s and 80s, an entirely separate line of parapsychology research emerged at universities, legitimate universities, published in legitimate, if narrow, journals, using something called the Ganzfeld procedure. A subject sits in mild sensory deprivation, half a ping pong ball taped over each eye, white noise in their ears, while a sender in another room concentrates on a randomly chosen image or video clip, and afterward the subject tries to identify which of 4 candidate images the sender was looking at. Random chance predicts a 25% hit rate. Pooled across thousands of trials collected over decades, several meta-analyses reported a hit rate hovering around 32%. I want you to actually do the arithmetic in your head for a second, because this is the number I chose specifically to make you uncomfortable. 32 versus 25 is not a rounding error. Across 3,000 trials, that gap is large enough that, if it were a drug trial, it would have gotten a medication approved and prescribed to your grandmother. That's the open loop, and I am not going to let it sit for long, because I promised you the correct picture, brick by brick, and this brick matters. The 32% figure comes almost entirely from meta-analyses run by researchers who were themselves parapsychologists. Not because they were dishonest, but because almost nobody outside parapsychology bothered running Ganzfeld trials at all, so the pool of data is dominated by people with a professional and, frankly, a career-shaped interest in finding an effect. When a skeptical psychologist named Ray Hyman went back through the underlying studies rather than trusting the pooled summary statistics, he found inconsistent randomization procedures, sensory leakage between rooms thin enough that a sender's enthusiastic reaction could sometimes be faintly heard through a wall, and the same gear again, selective reporting of which trial series got folded into, which published meta-analysis. When the tightest, most rigorously randomized, auto-fraud-checked version of the protocol was run afterwards, specifically to settle the argument, the effect shrank toward chance and refused to grow back no matter how many times it was rerun. The 32% wasn't a signal from another realm of physics. It was a measurement of how much slack existed in the experimental design, expressed as a percentage. This is the second return to the shrug, and I want you to notice it's sharper now than the first time, because you're carrying more tools. The lazy shrug says, parapsychology is fake science. Real science doesn't have this problem. The precise version says, parapsychology is what real science looks like when you remove the parts of real science that force it to correct itself. Replication requirements, pre-registration, adversarial peer review from people who want you to be wrong. Take those correcting mechanisms away from any field, biology, economics, nutrition, and you will eventually get a Ganzfeld effect in that field too. Several of them have already produced their own versions. This is not a story about psychics being uniquely gullible people. It's a story about what any body of knowledge looks like from the inside before somebody forces it to defend itself against people who don't want it to be true. Now here's something I need to admit to you plainly, because I don't want you to think I've made this too clean. The Ganzfeld effect, even after every methodological correction he just described, has never fully gone to zero the way the CIA's remote viewing program did. Across the most tightly controlled, auto-randomized, fraud-checked modern replications, and there have been several, run by researchers who would have been delighted to publish a null result and be done with it. The hit rate still tends to land somewhere around 28, sometimes 30%, rather than snapping cleanly back to the 25% chance baseline the way I'd expect if the entire effect were. Pure artifact. I don't have a fully satisfying mechanical explanation for that residue, and I want to be honest that it bothers me more than I let on in public. My best working guess is that there's still some subtle, boring, thoroughly non-paranormal source of leakage or selection we haven't fully identified. A statistical fingerprint of the humans running the study rather than the humans being studied. But my best working guess is not the same as solved, and I've spent enough years watching confident explanations collapse to be suspicious of my own confidence here. I'm not telling you this to reopen the door to psychic powers. I'm telling you because a person who claims to have every loose thread tied off is usually someone you should trust less, not more. Let that sit for a moment, because I want to widen the frame now, past spies and ping-pong balls, into the actual reason any of this should matter to you personally on a random Tuesday with no CIA budget and no ping-pong balls of your own. The mechanism underneath both stories, the file drawer, the outcome then judgment trap, the small residue that won't quite vanish, is not a mechanism about the paranormal. It's the operating system of human memory itself. Your brain does not store your life as a court reporter's transcript. It stores it as a series of highlights, weighted heavily toward moments that confirm something you already suspected, and it deletes, without asking your permission, the enormous quiet majority of moments that didn't. Your uncle's story about the time he knew the phone was about to ring, right before it rang, is not a lie. It is a true story about a genuine event, extracted from an entire lifetime that also contained 10,000 other times he expected the phone to ring and it didn't, and none of those made it into the highlight reel, because a non-event doesn't feel like a story. This is the third return to the shrug, and this time I want to flip it entirely. The shrug says psychic claims are stupid because the universe obviously doesn't work that way. I'm telling you, psychic claims are compelling precisely because your own memory is quietly built by the same faulty machine that produced Pat Price's cranes, running inside your skull, right now, curating your own life into a story that flatters your intuition far more than the raw data would. I want to bring in one more piece of the historical record, because it closes a loop I opened earlier about cost. $20 million sounds like a great deal of money until you set it against what intelligence agencies spend on satellite reconnaissance in a single fiscal year, which even in the 1980s ran into the billions. The remote viewing program was, financially, a rounding error, which raises a genuinely interesting question the shrug never asks. Why did a rounding error program survive for 23 years inside one of the most rigorously funded, most skeptically audited bureaucracies on Earth if it was producing literally nothing? The honest answer isn't a conspiracy. It's that Cold War intelligence agencies were, at the time, deeply and reasonably afraid the Soviet Union was pursuing the same research and might get a real result first. So a small hedge against the low probability, high catastrophe outcome made a strange kind of institutional sense, the same way a nation might fund a modest research program into a scientifically improbable weapon simply because the cost of being wrong twice, wrong about it not working, and wrong about the other side finding out it did, was judged too high to risk on confidence alone. That's not evidence for psychic powers. That's evidence for how differently institutions weigh a small chance of an enormous downside compared to how you or I weigh it over dinner. It's a genuinely different kind of rationality than the kind that governs whether you believe your horoscope. And conflating the two is exactly how these stories get their reputation for spookiness they haven't actually earned. Fourth return, and this one I want to aim somewhere you won't expect. It is astonishing to me, in the biochemical, structural sense of that word, that a piece of matter arranged as your particular brain, roughly 3 pounds, running on about 20 watts of power, less than a dim household light bulb, generates the entire experience of certainty you feel when you just know something is true. Every wrong hunch Pat Price ever had, and every one of the handful that happened to land, were produced by the identical biological machinery, running at the identical wattage, using the identical neurons. There was no special channel that opened only for the hits. The brain that drew a wrong sketch and the brain that drew a right one were, physically, the same brain, doing the same kind of pattern completion it does every single night when you dream a coherent story out of neural noise your visual cortex generates almost at random during REM sleep. This is where the floor actually drops away. And I want to be precise about how it drops, because I promised you this wouldn't be a poetic gesture. The unsettling truth isn't that the universe might contain psychic phenomena we haven't detected yet. The unsettling truth is that the machine generating your subjective sense of knowing something is real, the machine that feels, from the inside, exactly like direct, unmediated contact with truth, is running the exact same hardware, whether it's right or catastrophically wrong. And it gives you no internal signal, none, zero, not even a flicker, to tell the difference. Certainty is not evidence. Certainty is just a feeling your neurons produce, and they will produce it with equal enthusiasm for the correct model of reality and for the sketch of cranes that happen to resemble a photograph taken 6 months later. That is the fifth and final return to the shrug, and I want you to feel how far it's traveled from where it started. The shrug began as psychics are obviously fake. It ends here as something considerably less comfortable. The feeling of psychic certainty and the feeling of ordinary, ironclad, 99% confident everyday certainty are generated by the same undifferentiated biological process, And the only thing that has ever reliably separated the true beliefs from the false ones in either category is not how they feel from the inside. They feel identical. But whether they survive contact with a method specifically engineered to let them fail. Pre-registration, blind judging, adversarial replication, the file drawer forced open and its contents counted. Take that method away, and the difference between a Nobel Prize and a Cold War ghost story is smaller than either side would like to admit. So here is what actually happened in that program, stated plainly, one more time, now that you have every tool needed to hear it correctly. The United States government spent 23 years and $20 million building, at enormous institutional effort, one of the most expensive demonstrations in modern history of a fact about the human brain that costs nothing to state and everything to truly believe. That a mind convinced of its own accuracy is not thereby accurate, and no amount of internal certainty, however vivid, however specific, however many cranes and gantries it happens to sketch, can substitute for a method willing to let it be wrong. The tragedy was never that the psychics might have been real. The tragedy is that everyone involved, the viewers, the analysts, the generals reading the briefings, felt every bit as certain as you feel about the things you're most sure of right now. And certainty, it turns out, was never the kind of evidence any of them thought it was, which means the real secret the CIA spent $20 million and 23 years confirming was never about the Soviets, or the psychics, or even about the agency itself. It was about you, and what your own mind does, quietly, every day, long before anyone hands it a coordinate to sketch.